Welcome to Her Story, the podcast that brings to life the stories of incredible women throughout history. Each episode uncovers the remarkable lives, achievements, and struggles of women who shaped the world, beyond the textbooks and headlines. Join us as we celebrate their legacies and inspire new generations with tales of courage, resilience, and trailblazing spirit. In today's episode, I will be talking to Laura Adkins about Anne Herbert, sister to Queen Katherine Parr. Laura is a history blogger and author from Essex. Ever since secondary school, she has had an interest in history, where she was taught history was not all boring and academic, that we can explore, question, and visit the sites where our ancestors have been, that history is not one set story, but a mixture of stories, and as historians, we have to sift through it all to identify the truth. Laura has been fortunate to work at such locations as the Tower of London and the Banqueting House. She offers talks and tours in London, Tudor and Stuart history, and is an amateur ripperologist. Her first book, Katherine Parr, Henry VIII's Sixth Queen, was published by Pen and Sword Books in February 2024, and her second book, Richard Rich, Tudor Villain, is due to be published in 2026. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome to the podcast, Laura. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having me as well. Hope you're well.
It's my absolute pleasure. I'm excited to talk about Anne Herbert today. But before we get on to Anne, I thought we could talk a little bit about yourself. And I was wondering, when did you first become interested in history?
I think it's that I think sort of story that most people probably have. I was inspired by a history teacher at secondary school. Probably a little bit before that, we had this like little half day at secondary school when we were in year 6, and this man's come out in this class, tipped what we thought was a badge. We just thought it was it was just him highlighting that what we know from past is basically rubbish. And then when I then started secondary school, he was actually my history teacher, and a bit of an eccentric man, but he just really brought history to life for me. And I just found it very, very fascinating. He's the kind of person that would go past the do not enter signs in museums, and he'd walk along parts of Hadrian's Wall filming it, and yeah, he just made it really, really fascinating. Especially when compared to at the time when I was at school, the documentaries were, I mean, I've got nothing against David Starkey, but they were very that dull kind of this happened and this happened. And then I've got this history teacher who was really energetic and just like, yeah, and you can question history, and there's not just one set like story that we're told. And that then set me off on my sort of journey, as it were. And what also I think added to it was the 1997 film Titanic, that come out the year I started secondary school. Leonardo DiCaprio, Kate Winslet, and the whole fact that the ship obviously was inspired by the real sinking, and that got me going off wanting to find what really happened to the ship, and the sort of the real life story behind that. So both those things together at quite an impressionable age, kind of, I think that set me off to what's led me to today, just this fascination and love of history.
What drew you to the Tudor period specifically?
I think there's so many characters, sort of characters, because we don't know what they're really like, in that particular area. It's such a short space of time that initially that was, I think, I don't want to use the word easier topic to explore, but a simpler kind of area of history to look into, because there's so much out there written on it. And Anne Boleyn and this larger than life Henry VIII king who had all these wives. It was this whole thing of, oh, this is quite interesting. Like it's like a soap opera, isn't it? Really, what kind of went on. Um, so that kind of, I think, sort of drew me to it, and then the women behind, obviously, the men of the time, Emily Catherine Parr, Jane Grey, all of those women there, even Elizabeth Tudor, they just had these fascinating stories. So it's like, well, actually, history seems to be all men, 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 and there was these women, especially in the Tudor era, that were kind of stepping out of that mould. That I think that kind of, sort of drew me in. Although there are other areas of history that I sort of do have an interest in. I just think the Tudors, it's one of those things that everyone is at least familiar with. So they always have a view as well. Oh, didn't he have 6 or 7 or 8 wives, or weren't they all executed, or didn't Anne Boleyn have 6 figures? There's always someone that's got something that they can say about the Tudors, and it's like, well, actually, and I just think, yeah, it gets people talking, I think.
When did you first learn about the Parr family, and what is it about this family that interests you so much?
So again, when we learned at school about the 6 wives, obviously, learned about the six, and that Ryan, divorced, beheaded, died, and Catherine Parr, for a time, for me, was just that sixth wife who survived, married Henry later in his life, and that was that. And it wasn't until quite a few years ago, for Women's History Month, I decided, well, let's do these six wives. We had the musical Six that was kind of very popular. I mean, it obviously still is. And that whole, these women had lives and they were more than just a wife to this king. Um, and no offense to Anne or Catherine of Aragon, but I just felt so much is done on them. And I just sort of had a look at look more about at the others, and just Catherine, I thought, actually, this woman, she lived before Henry. She had a life before Henry, obviously. She'd married before, and I mean, and she had a life after him, and the stuff she did in between, and her being an author. I just thought, ooh, this woman is a lot more interested in than what you initially led to believe, or when I was taught at school anyway. So I was just kind of drawn to her. So I did a bit more research into sort of herself, and I chose her as the wife, this series of uh, posts that I was doing on the site with other bloggers picking a different wife. And then a few years later, Pen and Sword contacted and asked if I wanted to do a bit of a different biography on her, not just a straightforward, she was born and this happened. And that got me digging even more into her life and her family, and sort of her brother and her sister. I mean, especially her sister Anne, I had no idea sort of she lived, or she served under each of Henry's queens. I mean, what an insight she must have had. And even their mum Maud, and her life as well, and the influence she had on her children. Um, and also the fact that the three Parr siblings were survivors of Henry VIII's reign. They didn't really find themselves in harm's way. They had a few near misses, but they managed to sort of survive, and especially Anne. Her descendants are still with us today. Her and her husband, they kind of rose the ranks in Henry's court, and they continued that. And I think there's not many kind of powerful families that served on Henry VIII that can really say they come away unscathed by, well, not just Henry VIII, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth. If you survived one, you usually find, another member of a family kind of got imprisoned or had to flee under the other Tudor monarchs, whereas the Parrs, or the Herberts, as Anne's married name was, they didn't have that. They were kind of survivors, but also witnesses to this king, this Tudor king that we've all heard about. And I just think that sort of their story is just so interesting, so fascinating, that I want to sort of explore more on them. Because again, no offense to Anne and the Boleyns and the Seymours, but there's so much out there about them. It's like, now let's get the Parrs out there, you know.
Hmm. So, who are Anne's parents? And you've mentioned that she had two siblings, William and Catherine Parr.
So Anne, William, and Catherine, or should I say, so Catherine, William, and Anne, in the order they were born, their parents were Thomas Parr and Maud Parr. And Thomas and Maud were actually sort of members of Henry VIII's court when he had just become king. That sort of 18, 19-year-old young athletic king that we all forget existed. He'd newly married Catherine of Aragon, and they were members of his court. Thomas, it's believed, actually sort of served under King Henry and sort of was thought quite well by the man. And Maud, especially, actually is considered, or it's thought she was actually considered a friend by Catherine of Aragon. So much so that when her first child was born, she named her Katherine Parr. So it is believed that there's that link there. Sort of, it's in honor not just only of the Queen, which obviously was the norm at the time. You have named your children after, your family members or the King or the Queen, which is why there's so many Catherines out there and so many Henrys. It gets confusing. And Thomases, I don't know where the Thomas come from actually. Digress. And Maud sort of, it's believed she was quite a good friend of Catherine of Aragon. So when sort of, I said, her children were born, I think she raised them to respect the king and Catherine of Aragon, even after the great matter, the divorce and the dissolution, and Catherine of Aragon's sort of kind of banishment from court. I think Maud raised her children to respect her still and still viewed her as a queen. And Maud, unfortunately, became a widow quite early in the marriage. Thomas died in 1517, and Anne, her youngest, was only born 2 to 3 years before this. So she was left a widow at quite a young, with 3 young children. And most people in her shoes would try and find someone else to marry to support them, because that was the done thing at the time. But Maud chose not to do that. She then focused her whole life onto her 3 children and making sure they had an upbringing that they were then able, when they became adults, to make a life for themselves. And she gave them, I think, the skills to do that. She was influenced by a family friend, a man called Cuthbert Tunstall, and who was a good friend of Thomas More, and the whole humanist education that was coming across from Europe. So, like Thomas More, he allowed his daughters to be educated as well as his sons. He believed that women should have a decent education in order to prepare them to become an adult, to be good wives, to be good housekeepers. And Maud agreed with that, and she allowed, not so much sort of Anne, because she was a bit younger, but she allowed Catherine and William, and she educated them in this thinking, this kind of a bit more of a sort of an open, more of a bigger view on life, not just born to do this role and that's it. And I think because she was a widow with 3 young children, I think they were very close, or I'd like to think they were very close, especially the 3 siblings growing up. They grew up for a bit in Rye House. It was like quite green, open spaces in the country. And Maud also ran for a time what's thought as, you could class it as like a finishing school. Some other members of the nobility would send their children to finish off their education in her household. So she must be doing something right for other members of the nobility or gentry to send their children there. And then through her links with Cuthbert Tunstall and her brother-in-law, she was able to send William to the household of Henry Fitzroy, who was Henry VIII's illegitimate child, who people thought might have been legitimised to become future king. And William actually served in his household for a bit, and would then meet people like the Seymours and build these links that when he became an adult, if you look at the names of people in Henry Fitzroy's household, and then 15, 20 years later, you look at the men who was in Henry's court, there are some similar names that come up. And I'm sure those friendships and links kind of helped William or even Catherine. She wouldn't go out to finish the Henry Fitzroy school, but all these family links, I think, sort of really sort of helped the 3 Parr children to get started in life.
When does Anne first come to the Tudor court?
So it's believed she entered the Tudor court probably around the age of 13, about 1528, as possibly not a lady in waiting to Catherine, but in her court in that kind of capacity. She was only obviously a teenager at the time, but her mum kind of got this place for her to kind of set her off in, to get her a good position and therefore make good links and potentially find a future husband. Maud would actually pass away a few years after this. So as a result, Anne actually became a ward of the court. So rather than actually her mum finding a match for her and her being married off, she stayed in the court of Catherine Maraghan until, as we know, sort of Catherine was kind of sent away and banished from court, and kind of sort of had quite a sad life after that due to how Henry treated her. But for Anne, she would then, her services as a lady in waiting or a lady's maid was then transferred to Anne Boleyn, and sort of from there that kept happening with Anne. She just was able to serve under each of Henry's subsequent queens until she gets to sort of his final queen, which is her sister. And what I think is interesting with Anne is, all these different outcomes, well, so many different outcomes of Henry's wives. She managed to survive them all. She wasn't banished. She wasn't placed in the Tower at any point, under Anne Boleyn's questioning or Catherine Howard's questioning. She was always sort of kind of kept safe. Or she was able to stay safe. And I mean, I like to think that maybe Henry knew her well enough to trust that she wasn't involved in all these politics and factions and the naughty goings on of court. She had a kind of a head on her and was able to sort of navigate her way through and learn and see what these queens are doing and witness what was going on and serve them as she was expected to serve them, but also serve her king as well as the queens. I think with Catherine Howard a bit later, she was never questioned, I think, about her goings on, because I think she was clever enough to not get involved in what Catherine Howard was doing, but also a few other members of Catherine Howard's ladies were questioned because I think they knew her before she married the king as well, which is why they obviously were sort of brought in for questioning. And under Catherine Howard's questioning, Anne was actually given control of the Queen's jewels to take into her custody and to look after while the investigations were going on. And I think that really shows, I think, some form of trust in this lady. I think if there was any question mark over her head on her loyalties or anything, I don't think she would have been given a position. And I think especially when, again, Catherine Howard being sort of Catholic as well, I think that kind of helped Van Herbert, because by this point she was more towards the other religion. But there could have been various trips and falls that she could have had under Henry's queens, and she just kept on the right side of it all. I said from Anne Boleyn, she went obviously across to Jane Seymour, sort of tragically passed away. So for a time in between Jane Seymour and Henry marrying Anne of Cleves, she possibly may have gone into the household of Lady Mary or Princess Mary when she came to court as a female presence in court, and then obviously went back to serving Henry's queens again. To, like I said, sort of her sister, where when Katherine Parr became queen, Anne was not only lady in waiting, she was now chief lady in waiting. She was like the sort of head honcho, as it were. And even if it wasn't her sister who had become queen, I think it was a well-deserved position, because this lady from the age of 13 had served these queens. And I think if there was anything worth knowing, she would know it. If she didn't know it, it wasn't worth knowing.
Who did Anne marry, and when did she get married?
So Anne, fortunately, actually had a love match rather than having a marriage arranged for her, which was the expectation of the day. I know nowadays we think, it was these poor women were expected to do their duty. Anne was able to, I think, be an ward of the court and no parents telling her what to do. She, I think, was a bit more relaxed around her. And at some point, she come across a man in Henry's court called William Herbert. He was from Wales initially, and he was an illegitimate son. And also, there was a rumour that he'd murdered someone as well. So he had a bit of a nickname, Blackbeard, a bit of these sort of bit of a bad person, sort of dubious beginnings. But he had managed to get into the court of Henry VIII. Henry VIII sort of obviously trusted him. Obviously, wouldn't have had him in the court, and he was a member of the King's Body. And locked eyes. I don't know if it was love at first sight. You like to think that, but who knows? The relationship grew, and they married in February 1538 with the King's blessing, because again, any member of the King's court had to get the King's blessing to do that. So Henry actually gave him his blessing, and so they married, and they were very happy couple. Like I said, it was certainly a love match. They were a very ambitious couple, but also loyal to their kings. They never overtrod their. They knew how far they could really go. Henry, Edward later on, but they were basically given the Abbey of Wilton in Wiltshire, which is now Wilton House, and that was their main kind of estate. And then they were also gifted later from Katherine Parr, Baynard's Castle, which no longer exists in London, and that was their London base. They had 3 children whose descendants are still with us today. So I'd like to think that because it was quite happy, it was a love match. I think when Katherine Parr later caught, well, kind of feeling to Thomas Seymour, I'd like to think that maybe her sister kind of in that, because they both had these, lovable rogues basically that sort of they I think the Parr sisters certainly had a type, and it was very sort of happy between and William continued to be trusted by the king. He was a member of the guard, or he was appointed a guardian of Edward when Henry died in his will, and an executor of Henry's will. And during the whole Duke of Northumberland, Lady Jane Grey being placed on the throne, that whole kind of succession, William Herbert would be one of the people who would call some of the other members of the council who were at the Tower under Jane, and while Northumberland was trying to get Mary, and called them to Baynard's Castle, and was actually like, this isn't the late King's wishes, this isn't what's right. Mary is the rightful heir, and she should be queen. And he was one of the people who kind of arranged that meeting that enabled Mary to take the throne, even though William possibly could have been of the reformist religion. I think for him, he was one of those people. I don't think religion was as strong a motivator as it was for others, but Anne was certainly a reformer, a Protestant. So I think it's interesting that they put their support behind a queen, well, a lady who they knew was going to be Catholic, but it's because it's what Henry, their monarch, wanted. They were sort of being loyal, basically. And I think that's one thing that basically enables you to survive the court, really. If you're loyal to the king, you're going to survive. If you offend him, then that's when it's going to get problematic, to be in simple terms, and lead to losing your head. But yeah, I think sort of the two of them, I think, were really, really couple for each other. She, after her death, I can't remember which year she died from, nothing sinister or anything like that. But after her death, he was in 1552, sorry. She was buried in Old St Paul's Cathedral. And William has said that she was a most faithful wife, a woman of the greatest piety and discretion. He did remarry, but I think it was just more out of duty. I think theirs was a love match that, very rare, I think, in the Tudor times to have that.
Moving on to when Catherine Parr becomes queen, was Anne one of the witnesses at her sister's wedding?
Yes, I believe she was one of the people in there. There wasn't loads of people. It's quite a small ceremony that Catherine and Henry had, I think, because they both done it before. They weren't sort of young and in love and all of that. So it was quite a small ceremony they had at Hampton Court. And I believe that Anne was there, possibly with William as well, sort to see the union. And I think it would have probably meant a lot to Catherine having her family there as well. Because it was probably a very scary time for her. You're being promoted, the queen, but she was probably also terrified, I think, to have that much power and not to be prepared for it either. So I like to think that Anne and they're supporting her sister.
So you said that Anne kind of role of head honcho in her sister's household. What kind of tasks would she perform in Catherine's household?
So the ladies' maid generally, they would do whatever the queen needed. So getting their jewels, sorting out their clothing, allowing who could visit the queen, and just being a confident bedfellow if the queen needed it, and just kind of a companion. So I think to have a sister who was a family relation there, I think it made it even more. I think that bond even more close, because I think Catherine was able to probably be completely honest with Anne, about her feelings, her scares, her worries, and how she felt probably back towards Henry, and not worry that this woman's going to go and run and tell whichever faction wants to go against her in power, which I think was probably a lifesaver for Catherine when there was the whole, towards the end of Henry's reign, the whole sort of Catholic faction with Wriothesley and Gardner. So I'm researching something else at the moment, and there's all these crossovers. So I'll make sure I get the names right. But there's a whole Catholic sort of, and they wanted to basically topple Catherine Parr from power, because everyone knew, although they did speak about it, that Henry wasn't going to live much longer, and that he was going to leave a 9-year-old boy as king. So whoever controlled Edward would really control the power. So you've got obviously the Protestants on one hand, or the Reformers, and then the Catholics. And it was clear by this point that Catherine was definitely of the Reformist belief, most likely influenced by Anne, was very open about her religion, along with other ladies in Catherine Parr's court. I think they kind of Catherine to be who she actually wanted to be, to sort of to be more confident in her beliefs. Obviously, because she'd been married with husbands before and was trying to sort of do what she could, but being in the centre of court, you kind of sure you don't want to overstep the mark. And sort of Anne was obviously a Reformist belief, so was Catherine. They had people coming in doing talks and everything. So this Catholic faction, they felt, Wriothesley and others felt, that Catherine would be a good person to topple, and to get to gain the step up towards Edward. They questioned the Lady Anne Askew, who was all been arrested for her heretic beliefs, Protestant beliefs, and they tried to use her to get to Catherine Parr. Because it's believed some of the ladies in waiting, not Anne, others had linked to Anne Askew. And long, basically, long story short, they to then get Henry to agree to an arrest warrant towards Catherine Parr. And then Catherine got word of this and was able to get all the books hidden, and basically sort of, she managed to save herself and use her, I think, her relationship with Henry to survive. But I think not having Anne there, I think through all of that, I don't know if she may have survived it, because I think we all need that someone confident that we can confide in, and be completely honest with, and I'd like to think that sort of Anne sort of was able to be that for Catherine, to be like, look, don't give up, we'll get through this. So no actual evidence that relationship there, but just I'd like to think that Anne and Catherine were close for her to do that.
So you mentioned obviously by 1546 it's quite obvious that Henry hasn't got long to live. Does Anne stay at court after the death of Henry VIII?
No, she wouldn't. When Henry obviously becomes king, he obviously wasn't married. There was no ladies at court. There would have been no place for a lady at court. So the Queen's household would have been disbanded. Although Catherine Parr was referred to as the Dowager Queen, went to Chelsea, and remarried. And so I can't remember exact dates of her pregnancies, but I know there was a pregnancy around possibly just before that time. But she went into the household for a bit of the Lady Mary and continue that service, because Anne, pretty much, she was a lady waiting. That was her career. She'd made that sort of her career to serve these women, and I think she would have liked to have continued that service. I mean, I mentioned at the beginning, but she basically was the 4th generation of ladies that had of Parrs that had served the Queens of England. So although there was no queen, she would have, I think she got a place in Lady Mary's household for a time until sort of, if Edward got the age to marry, which obviously we know he unfortunately didn't.
We know of Anne's whereabouts when her sister tragically dies in 1548.
She was, it's believed, the record shows she was in the service of Lady Mary. I'm not sure why she wasn't at Catherine's house when obviously Catherine was due to give birth. It might be that where she was employed in service, she was unable to attend her sister. Catherine Jane Grey, so like as a ward, well, her husband's ward, and other ladies to attend her. So unfortunately, Anne wasn't with her sister when sort of was at the happiest moment of her life, giving birth to finally to a biological child of her own, and nor obviously a few days later when things took a turn very quickly, and she obviously tragically passed away, like obviously her former sister-in-law Jane Seymour had. So I'm sure sort of Anne would have taken the news quite. I think she would have been quite sad at the news, but she probably would have been professional enough not to have it impact, because that was how things were done back then.
So obviously you mentioned that when Edward died, the will goes to Lady Jane Grey, and William, Anne's husband, is one of the people that said, Mary is the rightful heir. Does Anne return to the court to serve who is now Queen Mary?
Yeah, so Anne had passed away, sorry, by this point. I know she was in the service of Mary when she died, so it was before sort of all of this, that she sort of actually had passed away, after her sister, and strangely enough, at the age of 36 as well, like Catherine. Catherine died at the age of 36, and Anne did as well, which is a bit strange. One of those strange historical coincidences.
Do we know where Anne is buried, and can we visit her tomb today?
She is buried in Old St Paul's Cathedral. I'm not sure, I'll be honest with you, if her tomb is still, we're still able to visit her tomb. I've not quite got that far in sort of looking at that part of her story yet, I'll be honest. Because I know obviously with the Great Fire of London, a lot of St Paul's was burned down. So that is the one, I think one of the one questions I unfortunately forgot to check for today. Sorry about that. I'm not sure if we can visit her. I think we can.
What legacy does Anne have?
So for me, I'd like to think, along with obviously her descendants still being with us obviously today through the Earls of Pembroke, which obviously is a direct line. Obviously, that's the title that William was given as, and as well, the Earl of Pembroke. They're also the Earls of Montgomery and the Earls of Carnarvon are all descendants of the Herberts. I can trace them back, and they're all in existence today. And I think the Pembrokes still live in Wilton House. But as for an actual legacy, as in on who she was, I personally like to think that she is she's a great role model. But by looking at her, it just goes to show that I think the Tudor court wasn't all sort of intrigue and whispers and treason and plots. I think she's this great example of you could have survived the call, by serving, by being loyal. And I personally, and this is only my own view, think she really, I think I mentioned earlier, really helped shape who Katherine Parr was as queen. Not helped shape who the woman was, but I think she really encouraged Catherine when Catherine became queen, amongst other members of the family as well, to be like, look, this is this position. Who knew this is where you're going to end up, and this is now your position. So own it. Sort of be what you were meant to be. Use your position to do what you can, and to sort of be who you want to be. And Catherine certainly did that. She loved fashion. She bought lots of clothes and shoes. And I think Anne was a similar person as well. They loved their clothes, they loved their music, their literature, their writing. They were patrons as well of the arts. And I think sort of Anne, through her sister, sort of really helped, I think, sort of us to, I think, enabled to help shape Catherine. So we remember Catherine and who she was. So that makes sense, kind of a background figure, if that makes any sense at all. But that's my personal view on her legacy to us, in the fact that I think she helped, one, to show that it wasn't all doom and gloom in the Tudor court, and that I think she definitely helped, like Katherine Parr with my book where I talk about at the end, helped, I think, shape Henry VIII's children and who they become. I think Anne, in her shoes, when Catherine became queen, helped shape on who she became as queen. Although I'm not got the research to back that up, I just think sort of that's my view on that.
Towards the end of the podcast, I like to ask my guests 5 fun history questions. So, firstly, have you got a history pet peeve?
I'm not too sure if it's classed as a pet peeve, so apologies if it's not. But it's one of those things I spoke at the start about, obviously, Titanic being obviously a film based on real events, and it got me going researching more. And one of my kind of thing that frustrates me the most is when people watch these films or these television dramas based on real events and take it as gospel. They take it as this actually happened and this is fact. Yeah, I know that Anne Boleyn did this or this happened. It's like, no, no, no. I'm all for creative license in films and in TV and that. And, otherwise it could be quite dull. I mean, and one of my, aside obviously from Titanic and two other films, before I digress, one of my other favourite films is Braveheart, which is so historically inaccurate. It's we could be here for hours on that, but I love the film. And again, watching it, in my sort of teenage years, and that I then wanted to go away and find out more. And that I think is what these things should do. But people, I think, watch them and then think they then know what happened, and then it was all about that. And it links to another kind of, again, I don't know if it's classed as a pet peeve or not, this whole one-dimensional view that people have that Henry VIII was a fat, ugly man that killed all of his wives, that Richard III was this hunchback that killed his nephews, all the opposite. He didn't kill his nephews and he was near enough a saint. I know I'm going to probably offend some people, but it's these one-dimensional views that we have of these people. And it's like, no, there was grey areas. These people were human and they had human emotions and feelings and these big life choices that they had to make. Um, and and yeah, it's just this kind of, some people are so very stubborn in their view, and it just frustrates me a little bit. It's like, to be a bit open to these views. Someone can be a bad person or do bad things, but it doesn't mean entirely a bad person. Doesn't make them good either. But yeah, those are two kind of things do kind of wind me up a little bit. I don't know if they're classed as pet peeves or not, but I was trying to think what could it be. So hopefully that has answered that one.
If you could go back to any event or day in history, when or where would it be?
So it's not a precise date because unfortunately we don't know the precise date, but I would love to go back and be a little fly on the wall at the Tower of London during the time the princes were imprisoned there by Richard. I would be fascinated to find out what happened to them. I have my views on what may have happened to them, and I know people have their views. And I would just love to find out that time from when they went into the tower to sort of when Henry VII becomes king, that whole kind of, where did they go? What happened? Were they killed? If so, who? That whole kind of, that mystery. I think that's always going to be one of those things that we may never answer, but I am absolutely fascinated by what happened to the Prince in the Tower and all these different scenarios on what could happen or what did happen. But yeah, definitely if I could view what happened, that would be it. I was toying with the whole um, who was Jack the Ripper, like if I could go back, but I don't think I'd want to witness something like that just to see who the murderer was. So no, but yeah, I'd love to go back in time and see what happened to the prince in the tower.
Have you got a favourite historical book? It can be fiction, non-fiction, or both.
Historical book. So one of my favourite ones that I've read, it's kind of, well, it's not factual as such. There might be some factual bits, but one of my favourite books ever is Treasure Island. I'll be honest, it's like the whole pirates, isn't it? And Long John Silver. But that's one of my favourite ones. And if I hadn't had to pick a non-fiction one, it would be, there's a book called Voices of the Titanic, and it tells the story of the Titanic from its initial design, its building, the voyage, the sinking, the aftermath, all from newspaper reports, eyewitness accounts, everything like that. And it's really, especially the chapter on the sinking, the people who survived and what they went, like what they witnessed, it brings me to tears. I mean, it's weird thinking you cry reading a book, but it really, in the way it's written, if anyone's interested in the sinking of the Titanic, that's one I definitely would recommend to read. It's one of my favourites.
If you could invite one historical figure to a dinner party, who would it be and why?
Again, so this is jumping quite back a bit from the Tudors, but it'd be Ethelfled, um, King Alfred the Great's daughter. Mainly just because I find her absolutely fascinating, and she's lady. She actually got men to follow her in a time when it was near enough a man's world, and they respected her. And she's the I think the only female from that kind of particular era that was able to successfully do that. Um, and I would just love to just to get to know her more, especially obviously we don't have many sources on her and who she actually was. We can only sort of second guess what her motives were, but I think I'd sort of yeah, she's one lady that I'm very fascinated by, but I probably would never do any research on because she's I think it's a very difficult era to research, and hats off to the people that have done it, and I love the fact that those people who have researched her, because it's it brings her to life a bit more. But yeah, she would definitely be one of the people there.
And finally, have you got a favourite history fact?
So I don't know how factual it is, but it is something that I love. Loved when I read it, and even now it's one of those things I'll try and share if I can, if it comes up in topic. Again, not Tudor related, but just after in the Stuarts, the lovely Nell Gwynn, one of Charles II's mistresses. There's again, don't know how factual it is, but there's this story that goes that she was in Oxford once in a coach, and the coach was kind of attacked by a mob of people who were not happy. And they actually thought he was Charles II's other mistress, the Duchess of Portsmouth, Louise de Quayle. Sorry, I've probably really butchered that name, who was Catholic, and they thought it was her. And it goes that Nell kind of opened the coach or stuck her head out the coach and was like, I think she says like, "Pray, good people, be good or calm down. I'm the Protestant whore." So it's like I'm horrible, but I'm the wrong one. I may not sort of. It's like she's actually admitting like her wrongdoings, and she's just like basically just an everyday common lady who was able to sort of to rise through the love of the king. But I just love this woman, like this character that she's under this potentially that the mob could turn nasty, and she's just like, hey, yeah, I am a whore, but you're the wrong one. I'm the wrong one. Like, and they were like, oh, and kind of left her be. That just kind of, like I said, but it is not. I don't know how factual it is, but I just love little stories like that we get down, because it really, I think, makes these people more human to us, more relatable. Than just this person did this and this king and this person was born here. She's a woman who sort of we can relate to, us everyday people who aren't kings and queens. And yeah, just the fact that she's the threat of violence, and she's like, oh well, the wrong person. And I think she probably could have quite gone off to the pub with them and had a drink if she'd probably wanted to. I think she was that kind of a down to earth thing. But yeah, the story always makes me chuckle, especially when there's so many dark and doom and gloom eras or parts of history, and then you get the little stories like that cropping up.
Thank you so much for coming on today and telling us so much about Catherine Parr's sister, Anne.
Thank you for having me. It's been lovely chatting.
Thank you for listening to her story. If there's a historical woman who inspires you and you'd like to share her story on the podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Get in touch at unholytudor@gmail.com. Until next time, keep celebrating the incredible women who've shaped our world.